Hello, I'm Sally Bliumis-Dunn and welcome to Poetry Break. We're very fortunate today to have as our guest Suzanne Cleary. Suzanne has published 2 books of poetry. The first is Keeping Time, the second is Trick Pear, both of which were published by Carnegie Mellon. Wonderful books to read. Suzanne has won a Pushcart Prize, the Cecil Hemley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. She's had residencies at MacDowell and Yaddo, and her poems appear in several anthologies: Poetry 180, 180 More, Poetry, The Atlantic Monthly, the London Daily Telegraph, and her book reviews appear in the Bloomsbury Review. We're very lucky to have her here. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I wanted to ask you, when did you start writing poetry, and what was it in your life that caused that to be something you wanted to do?
I am someone who hated poetry throughout elementary school and through most of high school, but my last year in high school I took a poetry workshop just because it fit into my schedule. You know, great academic tradition, I guess. And I had the assignment of writing a poem. And I wrote a poem, and as soon as I started reading contemporary poetry, I became hooked, and I fell in love with it, in short.
Yeah. So what do you think that poetry does for the reader that prose can't? What does poetry do?
Well, it's hard for me to think of it in terms of prose not doing the same thing, but I know that for me as a reader, poetry, it opens up an interior space. I think it welcomes me to a place of silence, or maybe a place of great racket and questions, but it's about the interior as opposed to the exterior world. And I think it's extremely important for that. I think prose probably does that, but there's a bit more of a meditative experience, I think, to reading a poem than rather reading a novel.
I think so. A certain intensity that poetry brings,
That's
simply by
a great word.
virtue of the fact that it's shorter and the words on the page way more almost than in a novel, I think. I wanted to ask you to start by reading one of my favorite poems of yours, Anyways. Maybe tell us a little bit about it, give it a little frame.
Okay, this poem is about Binghamton, New York, my hometown, and specifically it's about an expression that we use in Binghamton. The poem is dedicated to my husband, David, for reasons that will become apparent, and I think that's all I need to say about it. Anyways. Anyone born anywhere near my hometown says it this way, with an S on the end. The lake is cold, but I swim in it anyways. Kielbasa gives me heartburn, but I eat it anyways. She, he treats me bad, but I love her, him anyways. Even after we have left that place and long settled elsewhere, this is how we say it, plural. I never once, not once, thought twice about it, until my husband, a man from far away, leaned toward me one day during our courtship. His gray-green eyes, which always sparkle, doubly sparkling over our candlelit meal. Anyway, he said. And when he saw that I didn't understand, he repeated the word. Anyway, way, not ways. Corner of napkin to corner of lip, he waited. I kept him waiting. I knew he was right, but I kept him waiting anyways. In league still with me and mine. Slovaks, homesick for the old country their whole lives, who dug gardens anyways, and deep hard water wells. I looked into his eyes, their smoky constellations, and then I told him, it is anyways, plural, because the word must be large enough to hold all of our reasons. Anyways is our way of saying there is more than one reason, and there is that which is beyond reason, that which cannot be said. A man dies and his widow keeps his shirts. They are big, but she wears them anyways. The shoemaker loses his life savings in the Great Depression, but gets out of bed every day anyways. We are shy, my people, not given to storytelling. We end our stories too soon, trailing off anyways. The carpenter sighs, I didn't need that finger anyways. The beauty school student sighs, it'll grow back anyways. Our faith is weak, but we go to church anyways. The priest at St. Cyril's says God loves us. We hear what isn't said. This is what he must know about me, this man, my love. My people live in the third rainiest city in the country, but we pack our picnic baskets as the sky darkens. We fall in love, knowing it may not last, but we fall. This is how we know home. Someone who will look into our eyes and say what could ruin everything, but say it regardless.
I love that poem. And I love how David becomes the home in the end of the poem.
Yes, I think he does. I hope he does.
Yeah, I love that. In reading, I mean, you've read in lots of places and you have 2 books out now. Have you found that certain poems of yours have had an impact on people? Or are there certain poems of yours that you feel people have come up to you after a reading and said, you know, that poem really meant something to me, that surprised you in some way? And is there a poem like that for you that you would sort of land on and say, you know, this is a poem that people have gravitated towards? I'm just curious.
You know, I think that Anyways is one of those poems.
One of those, yeah.
And in fact, it's always very sweet that when people speak to me about my poems, very often they will, you know, I can see them working to include the word anyways into the conversation, you know, and I think they appreciate the humor of the poem.
Absolutely.
And I think they also feel that they understand in their own lives that there are certain ways we have of speaking to the people who grew up where we grew up, or maybe certain ways of speaking in our family, and that language is something that really binds us together. And I think that's probably part of the reason why Anyways has gotten a very nice reception in the world.
Yeah, I think so. I'm thinking of a book called Lost in Translation by Eva Hoffman. Do you know it? And she's Polish, and she comes to this country and she talks about the word teapot and how language is empty for her because she's just come to a new country, and so none of the words have their history. And you know, Anyways has a huge emotional history for you, so much so that you wouldn't even give it up for your husband. So
that's right.
You know, I wanted to ask you to read another poem, quite different in tone, Little Hat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to say anything about it or not.
Well, I think that I do need to say something about Little Hat. In Little Hat, there is a word I usually just define before I read it. I use the word toque, T-O-Q-U-E, which is kind of an antiquated word for an antiquated little hat, a fancy, soft little hat. And I think that's as much as I need to say about it. I think that it's one of the central poems of this book, actually, along with Anyways. Little Hat. 40 years in a round box, a nest of tissue paper, magenta velvet toque, your tasteful feather a moire of navy and green, your finely knotted veil, folded and draped just so. Little Hat, you were more the idea of hat than hat, actual, functional. Your function to wait in the box for occasion. Your emergence to confirm occasion for anyone who would notice your lustrous silk velvet, your grosgrain hatband with its 2 gold-toothed combs. Little Hat, how is it possible there was ever such skill, such time? How, in those years, that century, did you exact such care? Little Hat, satin lining, lingering scent of lavender. What if there was ever only so much tenderness in the world? If there is so much tenderness, but no more? What if there is no tenderness to spare, not one thread, one stitch?
I love that poem. And I think one of the things I love about your poetry the most is your love of detail and image, and how the details and the images of something, in this particular case the hat, widen into something that is universal. You know, the loss of tenderness in the world sort of seen through this hat.